folks. Welcome to the 2024 Border Archives Bazaar. My name is Dylan McDonald. I'm an archivist at New Mexico State University. We appreciate your attendance here today. During the Archives Bazaar, we usually have speakers who come in and talk a little bit about research that they're doing here in the southern New Mexico, West Texas, or the Borderlands region. And we ask them to talk a little bit about their research process, how that involves using archives, and it's really exciting for them to share emerging research that they're doing right now. We appreciate each of the 6 speakers that will be working with us today. Our format will be a kind of a panel discussion, so I will introduce each of the 3 speakers first, and then they will come and present, take about 20 minutes each to talk about their research projects. And then once that's completed, they will come up on stage, and then we'll have an opportunity to have a question and answer period with each of the 3 speakers. So we'll be in here for about 90 minutes. We have folks from the Doña Ana County Clerk's Office who are recording these presentations, and eventually they will be available online. So if you are interested in seeing these presentations again or sharing them with friends and family, please reach out to the New Mexico State University Archive, and we can direct you to the location when those are posted on the Doña Ana County Clerk's Office YouTube page, I assume?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, our first panel, our speaker will be Sean Schifano. He is a graduate student in the Public History program here at New Mexico State University. Sean is also working on a graduate certification in museum studies at NMSU as well. His current work focuses on the Sephardic Jewish history and identity formation in North America. Other present and past research has drawn on his academic backgrounds in environmental history and history of science, particularly ecology. Following Sean's presentation will be Loretta King, who is a recent NMSU graduate as well. She received her MA in Communication Studies from New Mexico State University in 2024. Her area of interest is in cultural studies. She was the curator, or is the curator, of the NMSU Black Programs archival collection. And following Loretta's presentation will be Daniel Webb, who is an interpretive ranger of the Taylor-Lucia Historic District, historic site. Before joining the staff there, Daniel worked as a visiting scholar at the University of New Mexico's Center for Regional Studies and as a visiting assistant professor at Indiana University Bloomington. He has research experience in local, regional, and national archives relating to the history of Lucia, southern New Mexico, and the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands region. So please help me welcome first Sean.
Good morning, everybody. It's nice to be the first speaker of the morning. Hope you've enjoyed getting to see some of the tabling and displays. My talk, as its title implies, is on an archive I've been building since January of 2024, the Crypto-Jewish Historical Archives, CJHA for short. CJHA represents the first sustained attempt to collect and preserve a record of Sephardic Jewish history in the American Southwest and northern Mexico. And for those not familiar with the lingo, Sephardic Jews are Jews who descend from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. And in this case, the Crypto and Crypto-Jews refers to people who are descended from Sephardic Jews and may or may not know about it because their ancestors either practiced it in secret, may have practiced it in secret, or were forced to convert to Catholicism in the aftermath of the Alhambra Decree in 1492. But to unpack this and really make sense of it, we have to take this international scale and really wind it back a little and make sense of how this community emerged and why it is the archive matters now. So, in the aftermath of the 1492 decree, about half the Jews of Spain were forcibly converted and about half went into exile. Of the ones who converted, some later moved, for example, to Amsterdam and reverted to Judaism. Some continued practicing Judaism in secret. Some sincerely converted to Catholicism. And this led to a melange of Jewish and Catholic practices in the Iberian Peninsula that really continues for about the next 500 years. But what I focus on is really on the emergence of a modern community and a modern identity formation in the aftermath of events that begin about 1917, so during and just after World War I. In 1917, a man named Samuel Schwartz, a mining engineer, is working in the borderlands of Portugal and Spain and uncovers in Belmonte, Portugal, a community that has been practicing Judaism and Jewish traditions seemingly undisturbed for a number of centuries. He is astonished by this and publishes it in a book in 1925. And at about the same time, 1917, we get an interest in Sephardic Jewish culture by this man, Artur Carlos de Barros Basto, a World War I lieutenant for Portugal, later promoted to captain for his bravery. He's also best known for being sometimes called the Portuguese Dreyfus, in that he was persecuted in much the same way as Dreyfus had been in the famous Dreyfus affair in France earlier. But Basto comes to know Schwartz and his work at about the time that Schwartz makes this discovery. And from this, he begins looking into his own past and finds that he is connected to Sephardic Jewish history himself. He converts to Judaism and forms an organization for people to look into, discover, and revert to their Sephardic Jewish heritage. In doing this, he becomes a kind of poster child and communicator for this community, and begins in about 1927 to found a newspaper called Halapid, which is Hebrew for the torch. And until about 1958, he circulates 156 issues of this newspaper with the main purpose of making Sephardic descendants who are not aware of it, making those who are uncertain look into it, and those who wish to revert to Judaism do so in the safety of a transformed world on the Iberian Peninsula. And here you can see in Porto, Portugal, the synagogue he fundraised for and helped build. It's now the largest synagogue on the Iberian Peninsula. And this gives you a frame of reference for the international scope of this emergence of a global community that is aware that there had been a Sephardic Jewish connection to their families or to their communities, but who were not necessarily aware that they had the option to revert to it. Many of them didn't, and many of them still don't. But of those who did, they helped Basto fundraise internationally for the establishment of the synagogue, which was finally inaugurated in 1938. And this sets the tone for what comes later, because in the aftermath of World War II, although there is a lull, the stage has been set for people to be aware that they too, whether they're living in Latin America or in other areas settled by Iberian conquistadores or settlers, that they too might have Sephardic Jewish ancestry, that this might be something they should learn more about. And so from about the 1960s and then through the 1970s, there was a surge of interest in this community and in finding out whether or not one has Sephardic Jewish ancestry. And it's occasioned by a number of factors that all coalesce over about the 60s and 70s to make this something that can be approached from a number of angles and will almost inevitably bring you in touch with the others. So in 1965, at the end of Vatican II, there is promulgated an encyclical, I believe I'm not sure if it's a bull or encyclical, but it's called Nostra Aetate, and this revises the Catholic Church's official understanding of its relationship to Jews, and in particular removes the doctrine of collective Jewish responsibility for the death of Jesus Christ, the so-called deicide doctrine. And this opens up a channel for anti-Semitism to be on the wane in the Iberian Peninsula. It takes a long time before that starts to happen, but it does start to happen. In the immediate aftermath of this, we get first the dictatorships of Franco and Salazar in the Iberian Peninsula, and then their collapse at about the same time in the mid-1970s. Israel, which had been founded in 1948, undergoes dramatic growth over about the same period from 1967, when its territorial holdings quadruple, through the 1970s. And in 1975, an organization is formed to help deal with the enormous influx of people coming in with requests to help find out whether or not they have Jewish ancestry, and in particular Sephardic ancestry. The Latin American world is huge, the Latin settled world is huge. And to handle the sheer volume of requests, an organization is formed in 1975 called Amishav. And you can see there in the middle, the American Sephardi Federation is formed at around the same time, and it's also not coincidental because it's also in the aftermath of awareness that these Sephardi communities are actually looking to find themselves again. And last but not least, there's a surge and boom in genealogy, an interest in genealogy. Part of that is occasioned by Alex Haley's book Roots, published in 1976. But in general, there is a much greater interest, partly due to the rise in DNA technology. This is really more to do with the 80s and 90s. We're not yet in the days of 23andMe and Ancestry.com. But all of these forces coalescing at about the same time create an atmosphere in which people who may not know about Sephardic ancestry become interested in it and start paying more attention to it. And beginning at about the same period, maybe a few years later, there is a new wave of research, and there had been interest in Sephardic Jewish culture for a century or so, but there is a new surge of interest with an eye toward understanding how it impacts the cultural makeup of the Iberian Peninsula today. And that fresh research on Sephardic history and descent isn't just confined to Iberia, but it's extending all the way to any areas that were settled by Spanish and Portuguese. So Latin America, Hispanic Southwest. And as these pieces of research, these separate trajectories of research start to coalesce and some kind of cohesive picture emerges, one thing that everybody catches on to is that there are these global commonalities. And the global commonalities consist mainly in Jewish and Catholic syncretism of traditions, but in particular generational knowledge, knowledge that is passed down from someone's grandmother, someone's aunt and uncle, parents, to the next generations, and the knowledge consists in practices that are Jewish in origin, but not recognized as being Jewish in origin because of the Catholic syncretism that they've undergone over 500 years. And this is also been found in day-to-day domestic practices, practices that are pulled over from, say, koshering food, but done for purely cultural reasons or as a matter of habit, and not known to be Jewish in origin. And then, in about the 1980s, this movement moves from not just coalescence, but popularization. And as it becomes popularized, these global enclaves, these global communities, start to consolidate into something like a self-aware web of movements. And the web of movements recognize these commonalities in one another, and they recognize that they all have a common purpose. So in 1991, the Society for Crypto-Judaic Studies is founded, so right on the heels of 1992, which is then the 500th anniversary of the Alhambra Decree and the expulsion of the Jews from France. So you can tell that it's strategically timed to coincide not only with past events, but with the wider awareness that is being spread by the fact that it's a 500th anniversary and a very important landmark for Jewish history, Sephardic Jewish history. And then with these local and national communities coming into contact, these common purposes, common traditions, common frames of reference for the past, this past of dispersion to various areas, starts to emerge in a number of countries. So Brazil, the Iberian Peninsula, of course, Mallorca, where a community had also been practicing some form of quasi-Catholic Jewish traditions called the Hueta, Mexico, and then the southwestern U.S. And of course, on the late 90s to the 2000s, we get the rise of the internet and global communication. And global communication starts an advocacy boom in which numerous individuals are founding advocacy organizations to help individuals determine whether or not they have Sephardic Jewish ancestry, and if so, what they'd like to do about it. As I said, many of them don't revert to Judaism. Most remain Catholic or some Protestants. But that general trajectory becomes the norm for interacting with communities. And almost all of this, although it's online and accessed online, ultimately is being promulgated by word of mouth. And the networks, again, although they're online or have online presences, are actually doing most of their work by connecting to others by word of mouth. And this brings us to CJHA, because now we have a century behind us of interest and attention to this community, and yet there's a supreme irony in the fact that this history and the historical memory of the community is one of dispersion. And yet, within the Southwest and northern Mexico, there has been no consistent, sustained effort to avoid dispersion now. There's a kind of very past-oriented sense that we want to rescue the community from the dispersion of the past, but not necessarily to recognize that our present is going to color the dispersion that we see in the future. So CJHA is intended in part as a remedy to this by establishing a cohesive record in a single place that collects documents and photographs, multimedia, connected to this community. So this is by way of a kind of mission statement here that CJHA is primarily concerned with claimants to descent from Sephardic Jews in the Southwest and northern Mexico. And this presents a particular problem. It is about modern identity formation on the basis of almost always incomplete information, but even where the information is better than average, it still can lead to inconclusive findings. And so, who are crypto-Jews? Who exactly are we talking about? Who does this designate? And the answer is harder than it may seem, because if someone had been practicing Judaism 3 generations ago, how assimilated should we think of them now? If someone was practicing a Jewish tradition 400 years ago, and that was so assimilated that it's become part of a more or less Catholic practice, do we count that as being crypto-Jewish or not? And the answer from an archival perspective is that adjudication is really not the purpose of the archive. I am not here as a booster for people making claims of Sephardic descent, and I'm also not here to say that people making those claims or any individuals making those claims are inaccurate. If I were doing that consistently as I was getting collections in, I think we'd have eventually an intractable problem of determining step by step who is and isn't, with the answer almost always being, we're not sure. And this becomes a serious problem, but also a stumbling block to preserving a community identity and record. So, how do we know? What are the epistemic standards? Well, in wearing two hats, I've had the good fortune to say, it doesn't have to be me, because I get to be a hunter-gatherer. This is a paradigm of the archivist as hunter-gatherer, and I mean, it's a clever term, but it really is standard in archival practice to be a figure of outreach and a repository for information, but not an arbiter or adjudicator of claims that are made. So the example I sometimes give is the Roswell alien crash. If someone were to come to me and say that they wanted to build an archive on the Roswell alien crash, and I'm sure someone's done it, I would say that it absolutely should exist, because the phenomenon is extremely important to understanding that time and place in American culture. But if someone came to me and wanted my opinion as a historian as to whether or not extraterrestrials did in fact crash in 1947, I would say probably not. So in working as an archivist, although I have to juggle two roles, the role that I'm mainly playing here is as someone who is not an arbiter, but a gatherer, someone who is trying to preserve a community record and a sense of identity that I may or may not agree with in specific cases. I may or may not find evidence in specific claims, and the lack of evidence doesn't preclude them being recognized as a member of the community and part of this identity and movement. Since I started it in 2024, CJHA has gone through basically two of its major phases. And the first has been simply the gathering of the founding collections, the collections that will form the first cornerstone of the material, of which we have 7 to date, maybe 8, depending on how you parse it. and then to establish the most promising potential collections for the future. I'm now in the process of doing that. I have been since the summer, and the process of doing that can be fraught because a deed of gift is always required, and sometimes in relinquishing copyright there are concerns about whether or not a family or a community wants to do that. But in the third phase, the second phase will kind of get backloaded, because the founding collections are really what will be important to founding, in a formal sense, the establishment of CJHA. And my hope will be to do that next November. I'm scheduled for the meeting on November 19th to propose and hopefully get established CJHA with the New Mexico Commission Public Records. If that happens, the records of CJHA will go to the State Record Center and be established as a formal collection of the State Record Center in perpetuity. And that will allow me then to connect back to 2 by adding future collections on a rolling basis, probably starting next year. And so just in the few minutes we have left, I just want to cover a couple of the materials that are in the collections. One of the most important is by this photographer, Frederick Brenner, who's very well known as a photographer of the Jewish diaspora worldwide, best captured in his 2-volume work, Diaspora, Homelands, and Exile. But in the early 90s, again, not coincidental, he produces a documentary, De Dernier Marin, which is Marranos, a word that is now derogatory but formerly designated members of the crypto-Jewish community, or of people who had been converted to Catholicism by force. And this documentary kind of catapults the subject in Europe in the same way that the Society of Crypto-Judaic Studies does in 1991 in the United States. And I was able to obtain for the collection a single photograph from him. And this photograph was taken in 1992 on the anniversary of the 500th anniversary of the Alhambra decree and the expulsion. And this depicts the community of Belmonte, Portugal, with whom the Society of Crypto-Judaic Studies has been connected since its founding. The photo is in a photo book that's autographed by Brenner. It's appraised by his gallery at about $5,000. We were able to obtain it at about half that, which was very nice. And that singular photograph is one of the most important because the people being depicted are actually members of the community, but also descendants of the first members of the community who were discovered in Belmonte, Portugal in 1917. Another collection is the collection of the late Gloria Golden, who was a photoanthropologist who in 2004 published this book. I hope everybody can read the fonts, a little blurry there. Remnants of Crypto Jews Among Hispanic Americans. I think I have a copy. Yes, okay. That helps. And it is to date the largest collection of oral histories with this community that have been done. Not all of them are from the United States, but I believe all of them were either living in the United States or on the borderlands of Mexico. And in her book, capturing these oral histories, she became the figure who became best known for advocating for this community in a public space. So I was able to, in the aftermath of her unfortunate death and her husband's death 2 years later, to get a hold of her daughter, Rachel, who actually had her entire collection stored in a basement, I think, and was able to get not only a full exhibit of about 20 panels from an exhibit of her book that she had done, but the original photographs that she uses in the book. So here are a few of those, just for a sample. Gloria Cordova, Gilberto Pacheco, both of these individuals participated in oral histories for the book, and are both, if I'm not mistaken, are both actually residents of Mexico. I don't think that they were raised on this side of the border, but I do think they came here as adults. Now this third person is interesting because he actually doesn't appear in the book at all. And all of the photographs that she takes otherwise are in the book. So I'm still trying to determine who this fellow is. But if I can get a hold of him, I would actually like to find out if his oral history survives and whether or not it made it into the book. Because since his photograph wasn't included, I have a suspicion that the oral history isn't there either. If we can find it, we'd really like to incorporate it into CJHA. And then Molly Longoria, very interesting case. She was referred to when she was a child as Seferina, which literally means a Sephardic Jew. Her parents called her that as a nickname and didn't let her know until she was a little older that the reason was that they had Sephardic Jewish ancestry and just didn't talk about it. And last from that collection, Father Simeon Clemente Carmona. He was a Russian Orthodox priest and monk who discovered when he was a teen that he had Jewish ancestry and never reverted. Instead, he converted to Russian Orthodoxy because, as he said, it was the closest Christian form of Judaism he could find. And he founded a small church in Albuquerque, as well as a small monastery, basically a chapel, Our Lady of Kazan. It's in the Morelos neighborhood, and here's a mural he did, and up there on the far left, you can see that he put himself in it. But he was approached by community members for about the last 40 years of his life to have their children blessed, quote, as he said, in the Jewish way. So there were other community members who were aware not only of his connection, but of theirs, and wanting to keep it alive by having him perform a blessing in the Jewish way as a Christian priest. The collection CJHA does include the entire archive of the Society for Crypto-Judaic Studies. As of October, I am now their archivist. This is about 85 pounds worth of material, and the real treasures are there at the top in those big folders, because those folders contain all of the conferences that SCJS had done up to 2007. And those conferences contain almost all of the talks by members of the community that aren't otherwise identified in publications. So a precious resource for the next stage, which I hope will include more oral histories. There's a nice binder. You can see it. Let me see here. You can see it there on the third row, the black binder. Absolutely full of news coverage. And Gloria Golden's collection also had a giant binder full of news coverage pertaining to this community. Most of the sources are things I would have never found otherwise, and a lot of them are in obscure publication routes that are just not generally known or preserved. This is the Society's journal, Halapid, appropriately the torch, the same name that Basto used for his, and the connection is intentional. So in addition to the current Society for Crypto-Judaic Studies is Halapid, I have also digitized all 156 issues of Basto's Halapid for inclusion so that you can actually see, if you're going through the archive, the international connection. And you can see there in the headline, Decano dos Crypto-Judeos. So they are already referring to themselves in 1929 as crypto-Jews. Nothing much to report here except that there's a lot more than I can show. These are the papers of Art Ben-Meniste, who was a longtime member of SCJS. He's now 90, and so he sent them to me basically saying that he wanted to get them into an archive before he died, and these contain a number of research records on particular families in New Mexico and northern Mexico who are believed to either be of crypto-Jewish descent or to have intermarried with people who are. And I think we're closing in on the end, but Stanley Hortis, the former New Mexico State historian in 1981 and 82, has a collection that's already been donated and accepted by the State Record Center in Santa Fe, and it's 14 cubic feet. Depending on how large the containers are, that's a pretty decisive large collection. He's best known for this book published in 2005 based on his dissertation research and 25 years after, To the End of the Earth, about crypto-Jews in New Mexico and the community as it existed, mainly in the colonial period, but with some reference to the modern period. He's a co-founder of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society, as well as a co-founder for SCJS. So he is a perfect anchor point for CJHA to be established in connection with his. And he very kindly agreed 2 months ago to incorporate his entire collection into the one I'm building. So altogether, we're probably talking about something on the order of 45 to 50 archival containers as a founding set of collections. I've been collecting relevant periodicals from every historical society in the Southwest and northern Mexico. These are from the Texas Jewish Historical Society, The Arizona Jewish Historical Society is working on getting theirs to me now, and the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society is sending me an entire run of their newsletter, Legacy, from which I will wean out all of the issues that pertain to the subject and incorporate them as well. And last but not least, I can't help but mention that although this is a record of modern identity formation, there are a couple of colonial documents that I've been able to obtain. This is a digital copy of the Inquisitional record of Francisco Gomez Robledo, who is one of the very few cases in what is now the state of New Mexico of an individual who was tried by the Inquisition for Judaizing, which is a specific charge for reverting to Judaism. And the exact results of this I'm actually not sure of, but the fact that he was tried at all is extremely unusual in New Mexico. You don't find very many records of this. You do find them often in Mexico. But having this record is therefore a very precious piece because it can probably shed light on exactly what they thought he had done and what the evidence was. So I think that pretty well wraps us up. That I hope gives you at least a whirlwind tour of what it is I've been up to, and a big shout out to Jonathan Pringle at the State Records Center, the Archives Division Director there, for being such an enormous help, and also to NMSU Archives for giving me an excellent series of trainings over the last several months to help me build this archive.
Good morning. My name is Loretta King, and this is Black History on Purpose. And I named it Black History on Purpose because Black history seems to have a way of finding itself into our history as a footnote. It's not a history on its own. It's something that's being added to add a little color, if you will, to an event that they're not receiving full credit for. Preserving Black Programs is the program for African Americans at New Mexico State University, and this is what I've been working on as my project. Let me tell you a little something about myself. I'm a recent NMSU grad. I'm over 75. I'm a retired soldier, public servant, mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, and activist, but I'm also a storyteller. I believe telling stories is the way to move your history ahead without being pretentious about it. I think that the Black culture has always been signified by the number of incidents you see on the news or how they're portrayed in written stories, and I think that it's very important to let you know that there's a real person and a real culture under everything that you're hearing. Tell you what I'm not. I'm not a librarian, an archivist, or even a history major. But in the last 2 years, I've had a crash course, and I tried to walk in their shoes, and I hope I'm doing them justice. But I'm here because I want to tell you things. I want to tell you about the importance of preserving the history of underserved groups that are in our area. I want to tell you about we're not here just to occupy a space and provide entertainment. Most of what you hear about us here is either bad news or athletics. So over the past 50 years, it's been a very vibrant society of African Americans in this area. So I want to go over with you a little bit of the historic preservation and the state of New Mexico. We want to talk about the project and the process of archiving. I really want to tell you my takeaways from doing this project as a novice and not having any archival experience at all, how it came to be. Those takeaways are really important because at the end of it, I have a story to tell you about how this is still being perpetuated today. Historic preservation nationwide is not a very important area. It hasn't been in the past. As recent as 1999, the National Register of Historic Places had a discussion at their 1999 conference that talked about the lack of identity in historical places of African American ancestry. And the state of New Mexico celebrates a tribe culture. And in this triculture, it recognizes the contributions of Native Americans, Hispanics, and Anglo, but it totally ignores that African Americans helped settle the areas in Mexico. I think what we're trying to do now, in 2017, I believe it was, that the National Trust of Historic Places designated funds to be able to bring this a little more to the forefront. Let me tell you about how I came to this. In 2022, Black Programs was moving to new headquarters on Inimeshu. I was hired as a part-time, temporary student administrative assistant because there was no funding for a permanent person. And in the middle of spring break, in the spring of 2022, the director of that Black Programs, interim director, she quit. And I had been there for about a month. We were in the middle of a major move from a headquarters that we'd been in for over 50 years. So when I went in to take a look at things, I found a lot. There were 11 file cabinets split up between 2 offices. Nothing had ever been removed out of any of those file cabinets. So I was looking at 1968 to 2022. A big chunk was missing because of a housekeeping error where they felt that they really had to clear out a lot of the materials that had been stored over those years. So we had a large gap. I was very concerned about the fact that we lost so much Black history that I wanted to conserve or preserve whatever it was we had that was left. And then it got worse. The project stopped me. I had an ancestral responsibility to preserve all of these papers. I had to tell the story. I had to make sure it was saved for later. So out of those 11 file cabinets in the 2 offices, there were papers in every desk drawer. There were plastic containers containing all kinds of stuff. Some I didn't really need to see. This was personal, so I really did have to get to work on it. I asked for guidance, and I received a lifeline. It wasn't anyone's interest that I preserve these papers or do these things, but I reached out to the archives on the campus at Branson Library. And Dennis Daly came to my rescue. They told me there was a place for my papers. They told me there was a place where they would be safe and they would be preserved. They also provided me with a safe space to be able to work on these papers and make them available in the future. And I jumped at it. My first day at the archives, I like this picture. It's fun. My first day at the archives, I went over and looked on the shelf and there was one box that represented a 50-year history of Black programs. And that box probably hadn't been opened since 1982 because that was the last piece that had been put in there and entered into the archives. I'm going to get back to this picture later, but that told me then that no matter how long it took, I was going to do this. So it became my master's project. My department head said, really? But it gave me every step that I needed to be able to complete this project because it was important not only to me, it was important to the university, it was important to the archives, it was important for the future that we have these things available to us. So, the work started. I didn't know anything. Those were the boxes that came out of the 11 file cabinets. There was 33 of them. So we went through the first step of identifying. Records management came by and Mr. David made sure I had the help to sort through all of this. I got 2 instructions when I first started out. One was get them out of the window, and the second one was get them off the floor. So I got a whole bunch of tables and got everything to where it was supposed to be, but this is what it looked like when we started in the 2 offices that we were working from. The next step was getting them sorted and organized to where we could move them. Oddly enough, this took from April until November to go through those boxes and determine what was usable material and what wasn't. I didn't know what anything was. Next, the papers were moved over in their boxes to the archives. And when they sat there, I thought, yeah, this is good. But they had to get processed. They had to be gone through, they had to be put in order by dates, by category, by, oh my gosh. So that took a while. I was hoping to get them to that section, that part right over there, that third step, to make them available, to make sure that they were ready to be used for research or for any other purpose that we thought might be necessary. So this was the archives process for curating this collection, getting it ready. That's what it looked like to me. So, number one was from April to October of 2022. Those were my file cabinets and boxes. And there you see poor Loretta. We don't know what's going to happen here. Next, from November 22 to March of 23, we were shuffling boxes around and figuring out how they were going to be sorted out and fixed. And that's when we were in the archives actually doing the work. So you see that squiggled out line over there to the side? I thought I was just going to hand them to the archivist and be done with it. This is it. They're there, they're safe, they're good. That's not what happened. See that line that goes down to Frazzled Loretta? Yeah, I was a curator. So the work was going to be mine. It was going to be mine from beginning to end, and I was real happy about that prospect. Then, of course, we got down to curating it, and I was really frazzled. Then I got over to the archivist who said, yeah, you look like you're ready to do something. And that's when it became a real collection and was accessible to the public. On Juneteenth of this year, we were able to put that on exhibit at the Branson Library. The Black Programs collection now contained, it took 25 months to curate, over 1,500 hours. 10 series, 151 folders, 23 archival boxes. Permanently located at the Branson Library. The collection includes operations correspondence, financial, events, assessments, other groups associated with Black programs. It also includes Black Studies curriculums and videos and photographs. It's currently on exhibit. If you have a chance, go over and take a look at it. Dennis Daly, Aaron Walls were in charge of making sure I got this right. My takeaways, really important. There is no black, white, or Chicano history. It's history. It's history. We need to be able to talk about that history. We need to be able to understand that all of these different parts make us the whole. So there is no separation. We also have to know that the best history is told by the people who experienced it. I don't know who can tell me about my history better than someone who's lived that history. I don't know that I can understand what they're saying or why they're saying it or the context that they're seeing it in, if it would be the same that I was living in, had I been experiencing that myself. There is no shame in ancestral history. You didn't do that. You didn't do that, so you shouldn't be afraid of that. You should be able to stand up and say, that was wrong, but we fixed it. So it's only wrong if you didn't fix it. So there's nothing wrong with falling. There's something wrong with not getting up. Truth. With truth comes knowledge and understanding. If you understand me any better by listening to what it is that I'm telling you about my culture, how I feel about preserving my history, then I've done something here. I've shared with you why it's important to keep these things in the forefront. I'm also curious about how preservation will look in the future. Our digital age doesn't give us a lot of tangible things that are going to help us to be able to determine the context of things we're giving it. What we meant, do we really want to say it that way? How we looked at things at that given time. So I am concerned about that future. told you in the beginning I was a storyteller. This is a story. We're represented by the art around us. We find ourselves and we see our representation in what we see around us. On campus, these are the art installations at NMSU. These are outside, inside, all over the campus where we can reflect on our heritage and see ourselves. This is the only representation of African Americans that I can find other than the buildings or a street name or a famous person that they put in the forefront that represents African Americans. This was the mural that was painted by students in the Black Programs offices at Garcia Annex. It hung there from the 1980s, 1990s, up until the late 2000s. In fact, it was removed in 2022. That's what it looks like now. It was necessary to paint over it. It couldn't remove it asbestos behind the walls. But my argument was there could be coverings over it so that it could be found art 50 years from now when we had a process that would have been able to preserve it. So the representation of me that doesn't look like this is no longer available for us to see ourselves as part of a thriving community. This is what we have to combat. This is what archivists and communities have to be aware of in order to keep from erasing very important elements of your history. And it's not just very important because it's my history. It's very important because it completes the picture. It tells all of us that we're part of something that's very big, and we can't take that for granted. So I hope that I went over the historic preservation in the state of New Mexico. I hope you understood about my project, which I'm very proud to have been able to do as a novice who is not any of those things that all of you are. The process of archiving, how I saw that archiving, and my takeaways, which keeps us informed that we are all one history, we're not a divided history. I would like to thank all of you for your time and attention.
Hi, good morning. Thank you all for coming out this morning to the Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum, to the Border Archives Bazaar today. My name is Daniel Webb, and I'm an interpreter ranger at the Taylor Mesilla Historic Site. And today I'm going to present a talk called Crossing a Border, Creating a Community, the Settlement of Mesilla under the leadership of Father Ramon Ortiz. So to begin, I'd like to thank the staff at New Mexico State University Library Archives and Special Collections for creating such a welcoming environment on the fourth floor of Branson Library. Dennis Daly, Jennifer Bolkeen, Teddy Moreno, Karen Wall, and Elizabeth Villa have all been exceptionally helpful in providing resources for my historical research. I would also like to thank Dylan McDonald for organizing this panel and inviting me to participate. So the presentation that I have prepared for today is going to have 3 parts. The first part, I'm going to introduce the Taylor Mesilla Historic Site and talk a little bit about some of the projects that we have going on at this site that's been open for a little more than 2 months now. The second part looks at the papers of Mary Daniels Taylor that are held at NMSU Special Collections. And I'll be looking at, in particular at her role as an archivist and as a historian. And then in the third part of my presentation, I'm going to look at the early history of the settlement of the Mesilla Civil Colony land grant between 1848 and 1853 through the role of Father Ramon Ortiz, who took up a position of leadership in that community during its founding. Okay. So this image shows the elevation and project information for the Barella Reynolds House from the Historic American Building Survey conducted by the National Park Service in 2005. Today referred to as the Taylor Mesilla Historic Site, these buildings stand in a prominent location within the original settlement of La Mesilla, which was established in accordance with the general laws of the Republic of Mexico in 1852. The Taylor Mesilla Historic Site represents an outstanding example of a mercantile storefront attached to a residence. This style of building was once commonly found in small towns across New Mexico. It is also considered an outstanding example of the territorial style of Southwest architecture and retains one of the few remaining metal front facades in the state. Here you can see a view of the Sala Grande and the residence. After acquiring the property in 1953, J. Paul Taylor and his wife, Mary Daniels Taylor, renovated and expanded the structure to accommodate their family of 7 children. In addition to his career as an educator and as a legislator, J. Paul Taylor was an art collector. During the 70 years that J. Paul and Mary lived in their home in the Mesilla Plaza, they assembled an impressive collection of period furniture and traditional New Mexican religious art, including boltos, retapos, santos, and many other traditional and contemporary art objects. In 2003, the Taylor family donated their home, the 2 adjoining storefronts, and the entire collection of art to the state of New Mexico. The property is currently managed by the Historic Sites Division of the Department of Cultural Affairs. So while the historic architecture and the fine art are often what attract people to Mesilla, it is the stories of the people who lived there that visitors take away from their visit. One of the people we learn about when visiting the historic site is Mary Daniels Taylor, who was a great collector of stories and a professional historian. Here you can see a picture of Mary when she was an infant. She's been held by her father, Albert Milton Daniels, at their home in El Paso in the year 1922. You can also see a poem that her father composed for his daughter that shed some light on her character. It seems that Albert was hoping to have a boy. Was fortunate that he had a tomboy as a daughter. These artifacts are part of the Mary Daniels Taylor papers located at NMSU's Library Archives and Special Collections here on Las Cruces. Mrs. Taylor's interest in history began at an early age. This is a picture of her as a teenager with the historian George Griggs. Griggs was the author of History of the Mesilla Valley, with a Gadsden purchase published in 1930. Griggs was also an art collector, and he opened one of the first museums in Mesilla, the Billy the Kid Museum. In this image, you can see Mrs. Taylor holding a sword that allegedly once belonged to the Mexican president, Benito Juarez. In addition to manuscript and printed primary sources, black and white photography is an important component of Mrs. Taylor's papers. Not only did she collect historic photographs in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, but she was also a professional photographer herself. For many years, she developed film and made prints in her home on the Mesilla Plaza. So her papers consist of an extensive research on the early history of Mesilla, including a wide array of primary sources that she collected from the municipal archives of Ciudad Juarez, the Archdiocese of Durango, and many other repositories. She wrote and published 2 scholarly books during her life. The first, The Mesilla Guard, examined the troubled relationship between Mesilleros, that is, the first people who settled Mesilla under the authority of the Mexican government, and the Mescalero Apache between the years of 1851 and 1861. Her second book, poetically entitled A Place as Wild as the West Ever Was, narrated key events in the history of the Mesilla Valley during and after the Mexican-American War, the Civil War in the United States, and the period of Reconstruction. She also collected and produced her own maps of a region that she referred to as the Rio Intermedio, the intermediary river. This region consisted of a broad swath of Rio Grande floodplain stretching from Socorro del Norte in present-day New Mexico through Socorro del Sur in present-day Texas. This map shows a subsection of the Rio Intermedio region and identifies the location of various Spanish, Mexican, and Anglo-American settlements in the area during the mid-19th century. You can see La Mesilla on the west side of the Rio Grande, on the opposite bank of Las Cruces. As a social historian who sought to represent the full spectrum of human experience, Mrs. Taylor was attentive to the central importance of indigenous people in the region's history. Her work drew attention to the fact that borderland communities consisted not only of people who identified culturally or politically with Mexico or the United States. She sought to tell a more comprehensive and inclusive story that paid homage to the historical experience of the Piro, the Manso, Tortugas, and particularly the Mescalero Apache. So as part of her research on the early history of Mesilla, Mrs. Taylor examined the activities of the Mesilla Guard. This is a painting of the Mesilla Guard by the NMSU faculty member Ken Merrick. Depicted in this painting, you can see the Mesilla Guard was a local militia that recruited men from Mesilla to participate in military campaigns against the Mescaleros. Rather than depicting these men as heroes, Taylor's book questions their motives and show that even in their own time, they were accused of criminal acts against the indigenous inhabitants of the borderlands. The Mary Daniels Taylor papers at NMSU highlight the diversity of people who claim Mesilla as their home over the years. Looking through her collection, you will find stories of French, Irish, and Polish immigrants who moved to the region in the mid-19th century. For example, the man at the center of this photograph, Jacinto Al-Adib, was an immigrant of Syrian descent. His name still adorns the blue tin facade on the front of the Reynolds store. There are many interesting aspects of Mrs. Taylor's life and legacy documented in her personal papers. However, for the purpose of today's program on celebrating Borderlands communities, I would like to focus on the scope of her historical research relating to the founding of Mesilla in the late 1840s and early 1850s. In particular, I'd like to discuss the life and times of Father Ramon Ortiz, who played an important role in establishing the original land-grant colony. This is another Ken Merrick artwork. This is not a historical rendition of Father Ortiz. This is something that he created after reading some of the historical scholarship that Mary was writing at the time. So Jose Ramon Ortiz was born in 1814 in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and he was only 7 years old when the Republic of Mexico declared its independence from Spain. At the young age of 15, he began his religious studies in Santa Fe. Upon deciding to join the priesthood, Ortiz moved to the seminary in Durango and then to El Paso del Norte, where he serves as the cura interino at the Church of Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe from 1838 through the beginning of the U.S. war with Mexico in 1846. Father Ortiz was arrested at his home in El Paso shortly after the U.S. invasion and occupation of the city in the winter of 1847. Later, as a representative elected to the General Congress of the Republic of Mexico, he expressed his opposition to the war in the terms of the peace stipulated in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So due to his personal and political connections with Santa Fe and El Paso, the federal government of Mexico appointed him as the Commissioner of Immigration at the end of the war in 1848. In that capacity, he recruited people from New Mexico to populate the new settlements of La Mesilla, Los Amores, Guadalupe, and San Ignacio along the poorly defined international boundary. Here you can see John Destrel's 1847 Mapa de los Estados Unidos, or Map of the United States and Mexico. This map is commonly referred to as the treaty map because the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo cited it as an authority in determining the location of the border. However, due to errors in Destrel's map, surveyors from both countries disagreed on the exact location of the border in the early 1850s. Despite uncertainty surrounding the border's location, Father Ortiz strived to fulfill his responsibility as the Commissioner of Immigration. The Mary Daniels Taylor papers contain numerous copies of land grants that he authorized in 1851 and 1852 as people moved to Mesilla and other settlements in northern Chihuahua. Through her archival research in the Doña Ana County Clerk's Office, Mrs. Daniels recovered information about the names of the original settlers who received land grants, where they came from, and the composition of their families. These types of records are a valuable resource for understanding change and continuity in the population of Mesilla over the years. Through her research in Spanish and Mexican archives, Mrs. Taylor documented the arduous process involved in establishing new communities along the border. Here you can see a diagram of an ideal pueblo according to the law of the Indies. This diagram shows the requisite components of a new community that were prescribed by Spanish colonial law in the 17th century and were later adapted by the Mexican government in the 19th century. According to these regulations, a town within a public grant consisted of the plaza, the jail and courthouse, the church, the ejidos, or the commons, the custom house, all surrounded by agricultural fields and watered by an acequia, or a main irrigation canal. So as the Commissioner of Immigration, Father Ortiz was responsible for adhering to the laws and regulations issued by the government, the governor of the state of Chihuahua, as well as the federal government of the Republic of Mexico. However, changes in the political situation in Mexico stymied his efforts. In 1853, former President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna returned to power and effectively ended the careers of civil servants appointed to the previous administration. As a result, Guadalupe Miranda replaced Ramon Ortiz as the Commissioner of Immigration. President Santa Anna also negotiated a treaty with a U.S. Senator from South Carolina named James Gadsden. The Gadsden Treaty, which was ratified in 1854, changed the location of the international boundary to encompass the entire Mesilla Valley, including the settlement of Mesilla within the jurisdiction of the United States. So the ratification of the Gadsden Treaty served as a conclusion to an important chapter in the history of Mesilla. For the first generation of Mesilleros, the lowering of the Mexican flag and the raising of the American flag on the Mesilla Plaza on November 16, 1854 was a sad and tragic ending. However, still today, there are many families in Mesilla who trace their roots to the founding era led by Father Ramon Ortiz. His zeal and determination to establish a new community on Mexican soil remains a source of great pride and patriotism through our present day. So thank you.
Thank you all for your presentations. There's a nice theme through them each, the use of archival records, which of course makes me happy as an archivist myself. Anyone want to begin with the first question? Yeah, Liz.
So I have two questions for Sean. One's a really general question and one is super specific. The general question is, when I've been in conversation with you about the building of your archive, it seems like individuals and families are interested or invested in being identified as crypto-Judaic. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that drive, or that interest in saying, hey, that's me, or I want to be able to describe my family in that way. Why would that be of such interest to people?
You know, that's a really good question. And I think at least a part of it has to do with the uncovering process itself. That, I'll use an example. There's an account in the book Gloria Golden published about a family whose grandfather would become extremely perturbed and short-tempered whenever Judaism was mentioned. And this went on for 35 years. Anytime the subject came up, he would get annoyed. And one day at about age 87, when he was in ill health and his health was declining from that, he decided that now was the time to gather the entire family together because he had something to tell them. And as you might imagine, the thing he told them was, "Somos judeos," we are Jews. And I think in the aftermath of a process like that, there is something about learning a part of yourself that you didn't have a frame of reference for or an ability to place before that comes to dominate something about the way you think. And I think that actually dovetails nicely with your talk, Loretta, that knowing a history that you think you have and then finding out that you have to radically alter and revise the way that you understand yourself, or even that you might have to radically alter the way you think about yourself, is at first a jarring thing, but also something that connects you to another community. And as I've been around New Mexico and seen some of the communities, and in El Paso I've seen some of the communities, the one consistent factor that I see isn't so much an urge to be thought of as Jewish, but an urge for people to understand the experience as they found it. To have at least some small taste of what it was like to have been a person who had no knowledge of this before, whose grandmother, let's say, lit candles in a closet on Friday night and you have no reason to understand why she's doing it and just assume that it's a Catholic practice. And to find out only after she's gone and you can't speak to her again that the reason was that she was probably lighting them because 5 generations back, someone had been doing that for Shabbat and didn't know it. So I think it's less a desire to be thought of as Jewish as such, and more of a desire to be thought of as Jewish by proxy with the discovery that this is who you are. And even in cases where, as in the majority, in fact, people who find this out don't convert to Judaism. I showed Father Carmona before. He became a Russian Orthodox priest. He left the Catholic Church because he could not remain in a church that he considered to be the arm of persecution of his ancestors. And yet he joined a Christian church and didn't revert to Judaism. So when he was asked, "Are you Jewish?" he would say yes, and people would find this very baffling because you're a Russian Orthodox priest, for goodness sake. And he would say, exactly. Because the idea for him wasn't one of it being a totalizing form of identity, but one that was inseparable from how he thought of himself. And when people would come for these blessings, in the Jewish way, as he says, they come with the understanding that they aren't going to convert either. And as far as I know, all of the people who sought blessings from him were not halakhically Jewish by conversion or some other step that they took. They just wanted that to be understood as part of their identity. Does that answer your question a little more?
It does. It's a little bit to be continued in discussion with us in the future, but I want to leave room for other questions and just quickly ask my second question, which is that, you know that I teach a class on the history of food, and I've been reading a lot recently about the history of food in the Spanish Inquisition, and the way that, for instance, conversos and moriscos in Spain at the end of the 15th century would often put a rasher of bacon on their window to get people to basically leave them alone.
Yeah.
Right? And that it was through different forms of cooking. For instance, if conversos cooked with chickpeas and eggplant and oil instead of with lard, that Christians in their neighborhood would often be able to identify that, or so they thought, as conversos are hiding their Judaism, because Christians cooked with pork and lard. It's really, really interesting material. And in the long haul, I'm just curious if in your archival material you find histories of foodways that identify this group for themselves.
Yes, definitely. In several oral histories, and this is part of the international traditions that I mentioned before, these community commonalities in far-flung places. Among the people in Gloria Golden's book and others who are not in the book, several talk about the practice of a family blessing an animal before it was killed and not doing it in a particularly Christian way, by which I mean one of the families had a prayer that would repeatedly stress the unity of God. And they understood from their parents, who were deceased by the time this was recorded, that you were not to mention Jesus. Which seems like an odd thing to do if you are blessing them in a Catholic tradition. The blade was to be sharpened as much as humanly possible. It was to be washed and then drawn across the throat and allow blood to drain. And in the same account, the meat that is then taken from the animal is soaked in water. And when the son, in this case, asked his father why this was being done, he said to tenderize it. Well, if you know anything about meat preparation, soaking it in water is going to ultimately dry it out. It sounds counterintuitive, but it's ultimately not going to tenderize the meat. It's going to make cooking it tougher. And the reason was simply understood as being one that, but he said the important thing to do is to get all of the blood out.
So they're doing their own kashrut as much as
they're effectively doing a form of kashrut. And there are some wrinkles that are not identical to the traditional halakhically Jewish kashrut, but it's similar enough and distinct enough from their neighbors that when they go even to relatives who are at one remove, they don't do it. And they say, well, Dad, why are you doing it if they don't? Because the assumption is that this is some kind of Catholic tradition, and it isn't. They generally don't know about it. There are families and oral histories that talk about not eating pork, and nobody in the family has any apparent problem with this. Nobody ever mentions it. And in New Mexico, that's interesting because historically there were very, very few pigs in New Mexico. It's very dry at high altitude. It's not a place where you generally bring pigs. And so it wasn't really thought about. But in this case, the reason was that 4 generations ago, they told us not to, and then they told us not to, and then on and on. And so you get certain practices of kashrut that are Jewish in origin, but seem also to be connected to the environment in ways that are just part of what we do. And so nobody in the family, although no one eats pork in the entire extended family, nobody looks into the reason why, because they just assume it's a thing that we do, even though nobody in the community around us does that.
Super interesting, thanks. To be continued, we'll discuss more. I have a question for Loretta. Loretta, what is your relationship with the archives currently? Are you still connected in any way? Or do you have plans to be?
I think that'll be an eternal connection.
Good.
I don't think I'm going anywhere anytime soon. I'm truly fascinated by the history that's housed there. I think if you could pull everything out and be able to incorporate times with events, you would find that everyone was doing the same thing at the same time, but only had their cultural spikes in there that made a difference. And I think that those spikes are really important because they distinguish us as being able to maintain who we are while being part of something else. And I think that that's always wonderful.
Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Actually for Sean, or actually for all three of you, you've collected these materials. First of all, are they at New Mexico State on the campus being stored there?
You want to start with that?
So yeah, the collections that I was working with, the Mary Nichols Taylor papers, the family donated those, and the original accession has a finding aid, but there is a lot of material that's still being processed by archivists, so they're trying to make, for example, a lot of the family photographs and a lot of Mary's own photographic work available to the public. Some of that might not be on the finding aid, so it's some of it is in this sort of gray limbo area, but there are formal collections that the public can go and see on the 4th floor Branson Library on campus.
Are there any plans to digitize those other than in your great fantasies?
We're trying.
Maybe in the future. There's so much overhead just in collecting the initial founding collections that getting them established in a physical space is the important thing in this phase. But maybe sometime next year. And in answer to your question about NMSU, yes and no. The collections I've been building are at NMSU. Maybe I shouldn't disclose, but they are at NMSU, but they are not in the archives because that's not where I'm intending to house them permanently. Because Stanley Hortis' papers are at the State Records Center, and that's also where the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society's papers are, the goal will be to get CJHA housed there permanently as well.
And the Black Programs collection is currently on exhibit on the 4th floor at Branson Library. Take a minute, walk by and take a look. We've done some wonderful changes over the last 50 years, and I think it would really be interesting to see how the university has evolved in being able to accommodate and grow along with the Black student body that's been there.
I have a question for Loretta.
Yes.
When you did your sorting through all of the materials that you found, did you see any references to the Phillips Chapel in the Mesquite Historic District and also to Vado and its settlement?
You know, it was pretty specific to the Black programs. There is information available on Vado, and do you have information, Dennis?
Yes, we do have some materials on Blackdom and the people that settled in Vado, and also on the Black families that came out around 1907, I think it was, from Oklahoma, which formed the first kind of community of Black residents in Las Cruces. They settled in the Mesquite neighborhood.
we have the Clarence Fielder reading room in the history department, and it's my understanding that it's all his books right there.
Yes.
So it's all of Clarence's books too, so then that's an open reading room, and you can kind of come and shelf it too. So it's a mini archive of his work, or the stuff he read that influenced his work.
Any other questions?
I have a question for Daniel.
I'm sorry?
For Daniel? Sure. I was wondering if Mary Daniels had done any interaction, done any research on, with the fountain pen, the Messiah Pearl Fountain. I was wondering if you could say anything about that.
Sure. So her collection is really diverse. She collected pretty much anything she could get her hands on as it related to the history of Messiah. There are about 45 manuscript boxes that are just jam-packed with all sorts of materials, and some of the stuff related to the Fountain family that I've seen has to do with the period of time when he was working as a customs collector in El Paso. And Colonel Albert Jennings Fountain was living in El Paso previous to moving to Messiah, and so you'll see his signature on receipts for invoices of goods being imported across the border. And occasionally you may see some other related records, but there is a very small collection relating to Albert Fountain within the archives, and I have not looked at it, but I have seen little drips and drabs of his archival record within the Daniels papers.
Thanks.
I'm just curious, is there, with black programs, has there been any money kind of set aside maybe to encourage students to work on the collection, like produce a paper or anything? Is there a scholarship, fellowship?
We're hoping with the exhibition and people knowing that the collection is now searchable, it's now available, I think that that'll bring a little more interest into that. I think that that'll spur a few donors and a few other things that will help us advance this a little further. I'm very hopeful, and I'm really even more hopeful that it will encourage other groups, Chicano programs, Native American programs, Asian and Pacific Islanders, LGBTQ. Start collecting your documents and start making them available to where you're not hidden. Yes, ma'am.
Have you thought of extending it to an oral history project?
Absolutely, I'm going in for my doctorate, and that's going to be on the agenda. I think that being able to have people tell their own story is one of the most intriguing ways to find out that you didn't know what you didn't know. I think that we need to be a little more aware that someone may say things a little bit different than you do. Some people may prepare things a little bit different than you, but you're all doing the same thing. So I think that it's very important for people to tell those stories and to be able to, to find the connections. We really need to find those connections.
I have a question about Messiah. In Mary Taylor's manuscripts and things, did you see anything about political aspects of Messiah where there was a terrible tragedy in the plaza with two conflicting parties having arguments and shooting?
In her papers, she has a manuscript chapter from her book, A Place as Wild as the West Ever Was, that looks at that particular episode. But where you would find the greatest documentation is in the John Lemon family papers. And John Lemon was the individual who unfortunately lost his life along with 8 others in that political riot in August of 1871. And the archives has a pretty extensive collection that his family put together in his memory. It includes a lot of contemporary sources from the 1860s through 1871. So I would recommend taking a look at that for understanding that and a little bit better.
Our first speaker today is Joel Gonzalez-Parra, who is a Nair Scholar at New Mexico State University, where he's a Communication Studies and History undergraduate. Joel focuses on borderlands history with an approach that aims to apply transnational archival practices in the study of the American Southwest and Mexican American history. Our second speaker will be Joseph Ramon Michael Longo. He's a curatorial volunteer at the McGoffin Historical Home Site. Joseph has a BA in political science from UTEP with a minor in museum studies and a master's in museum studies from the University of Oklahoma. He's given lectures and written articles relating to El Paso women, political history, and education. He's the former curator and archive chair of the El Paso County Historical Society and has curated exhibits for the McGoffin Home Site and the El Paso Mission Trail Association. Our final speaker will be Michael E.P. Davis, the chairman of the East Side Central Coalition Association. Michael was born and raised in El Paso, where he graduated from Austin High School in 1971. A retired Army officer, Lieutenant Colonel Davis is the CEO and president of Davis Page Management Systems, LLC, a company that provides integrated preparedness, security, and risk management services. Davis is the son of Esteem Davis, who was a longtime owner of the Esteem Eastside Barbershop, future site of a museum whose mission is to educate the public on the contributions of Black business owners to El Paso's prosperity. So join me first in welcoming Joel.
Hello, thank you very much for being here. I hope that you have found something interesting on your visit so far to this event. So, my topic, Shaping Model Identities, is a project that just started over the past summer as part of my McNair program or research internship. And the whole purpose of this project was to look into those communities that were founded in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War. We already heard a little bit about Mesilla with the representation of Mr. Webb. Now I want to focus a little bit more on those places that were settled beyond Mesilla. So one of the aspects I want to start with is the political and social climate of New Mexico once the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. So in that, oh, there we go. So we'll go through the cultural and social climate of New Mexico by the end of the war. Then the colonization decrees, the project that the Mexican government settled in order to attract New Mexicans to settle along the Chihuahua border. And then we'll just take a look at some of the towns and how they will later incorporate into the larger nation. So the first thing to note is that records at the time show that people in New Mexico were pretty conflicted about their ideas of staying or living for the Mexican Republic. You had armed resistance in the form of the Taos and Mora revolts, but at the same time, you have people that are welcoming the new form of government, especially because at this time New Mexico is being very dependent on the American market, especially that's coming through the Santa Fe Trail from Missouri. So you have people wondering if what's the best for them, to just stay and adopt the new form of government, or to leave and try their luck on the new settlements. In that context, you had the creation of colonization decrees. On July 18 of 1848, you had the first decree that establishes the principles to create military colonies along the new frontier. And later you have the decree of August 19, 1848, in which you have the principles in which people can move to the new boundary, claim land, free land, and establish themselves in the strategic points that will help. And this is the main purpose that the Mexican government had at the time, to create a barrier in the new frontier that will help against Indian raids and further American interventions as they were fearing. That's where you have the figure of Ramon Ortiz as Commissioner of Colonies in Mesilla, Guadalupe, and San Ignacio. Later he will create other places in Santo Tomás de Iturbide and Nuestra Señora del Refugio. And all these laws are being passed by in the term of José Joaquín de Herrera. So moving south, you have the first colonies being created in Guadalupe, San Ignacio, Mesilla, of course. I will talk later about Ascension and why there's like a gap in time there. Here's a map so you can visualize the places of these towns along the New Mexico-Chihuahua border. Guadalupe and San Ignacio, as you can see, they're closer to the Texan border, but the reason why I still include them in this study is because when looking at the census of the time, at the demographic data that Samuel Cisneros, archivist at UNM, provided for these towns, you can see that most of the families come from the Rio Abajo area of New Mexico, especially because most of the population that stayed was incorporated into northern New Mexico. Some people saw utility in going to Chihuahua, as they were part of less populated areas in southern New Mexico that were more prone to attack by Indian raid. So struggle and incorporation into the larger nation. This is a part I want to talk about the most, because when talking about these communities, there's some scholarship that mentions them, but there isn't a lot of studies on how these communities performed once they were settled in Mexican territory. Of course, a constant that you see in these communities is a lot of disputed land, faulty surveys. The Mexican government didn't really provide all the resources that they promised at first. And that created a lot of political involvement from the half of these communities. There were not a lot of people. There are estimates that says that around 4,000 people moved to these communities, but they will play a huge role in early dynamics in the Mexican-American border. For example, if we look at Guadalupe and San Ignacio, they were settled by people from the Rio Abajo area of New Mexico. There was also a huge population that came from the towns of Socorro, Isleta, San Elizario, because these towns were at first on the Mexican side, but then the Rio Grande changed its course, and under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, everything that was on that side of the river will be American territory. And something interesting is that when these communities started to adhere to El Plan de Jalisco or El Plan de Hospicio, in which different states in Mexico were trying to pose a federal system of government that will provide more liberty to the states to take care of their own issues, especially to the northern states that were being depopulated and were having big trouble dealing with Native American groups. You have these towns being the first ones to send the declarations of adherence to the new movement. Guadalupe, San Ignacio, La Mesilla, even smaller places like Santo Tomás de Iturbide and Nuestra Señora del Refugio will send letters to the state government saying that they will take part of that political struggle. And something interesting to see is the way that these towns start to interact with the border and with the closest communities in there. When the army that was raised in Guadalupe and San Ignacio is forced to disband, a lot of these people will flee to those towns where they were living before. San Elizario, Socorro, and Isleta. And they will use their extended families, people that they already know, other connections, to claim U.S. citizenship, to argue in judicial processes that they are citizens of the United States, that they haven't lived the territory of the United States. And once things were a little bit better in political terms, then they will come back, they will take again those lands that they had in these colonies. And you see that concept of extended families playing out by people moving back and forth, depending on their own interest. We see something like this with a colony that I didn't include here, because I need to do more research on it, the colony of Zaragoza. So in 1862, when civil war breaks out in the United States, you have people sending petitions of repatriation to Chihuahua, people from Doña Ana, from Mesilla, and from other Texas towns. And they will use this rhetoric where they claim that they always wanted to come back to Mexico. But then you see that these colonies are really short-lived, because the full intention of the people is actually just to flee the conflict in the United States, to avoid clashes with Confederate forces, and in most of the cases just to avoid being enlisted in any of the armies that are fighting in American soil. We also have the Mesilla riots of 1871, as someone in the public in the previous presentation asked about that. And this is also interesting just to expand on this concept of extended families and how these communities use the border as some sort of refuge. Depending on the political situation, the economic situation, they will just move back and forth according to what was needed for their communities. In August of 1871, as Mr. Webb mentioned in his presentation before, you have a political conflict taking place in the Plaza of Old Mesilla. Both Democrat and Republicans are rallying around the plaza. That led to a confrontation. And once the Democrats were able to secure their authority by winning the elections of that year, you have a party of around 500 Republicans from Mesilla taking all their stuff and moving down to Ascension in Chihuahua and founding a new colony in 1872. And it's interesting to see the different narratives that the new colonists will employ as to explain the reasons why they're taking this land in the state of Chihuahua. A good example is a letter that they sent to the Mexican president in 1975. And I would like to share a quote from that letter so we can start comparing the different language and the narratives that they use. For example, in explaining their decision to come back to Mexico, these colonists that will found the town of Ascension will say, "We choose to establish ourselves as colonies in the beautiful Mexican land, seeking the shelter and protection of the flag to which we once belonged. But due to political upheavals, we had to belong to the United States of the North. And not in agreement with this change, we made efforts to come and reside in the land that corresponds to our supreme government of the Mexican Republic." Now it's interesting to see these claims of patriotism, because you will think that a group of people, of Hispanic people, who are already taking part of the political processes of the United States is a sign of incorporation into the new form of government. But there are some reasons and contrasts in these declarations. After this quote, they go ahead to ask for 21,000 acres of free land for the new colonists. And we later have reports of people who are constantly moving back and forth. They will claim land in Ascension, they will have their residence in Mesilla, and they will try to do business that way. A more genuine claim could be a letter that was sent from Ascension to Mesilla, in which the colonies announced the creation of the Central Commission of Immigration of Ascension. And quoting the letter, the purpose of this commission was to gather the names of every Republican who wishes to migrate to the new colony. So it's interesting to see how the discourse of patriotism and nationalism, once they're talking within their intimate circles in Mesilla, becomes more of an issue of political conflict within that specific community. And this conflict will not end there. One of my main interests when looking into this town was to see how this community fared once they left Mesilla, because you have a lot of scholarship in Mesilla, but usually I will look into Ascension and it's like, well, they left the border, and as soon as they cross the border, they're just like vanished, right? But it was interesting to see how, even when everything seems to be going well for the people in Ascension, they still have some of the problems that we see in other colonies. There's still issues with land, faulty surveys. The Mexican government is delaying on giving out the land titles for private owners in the community. And 20 years later, 20 years after the riot in Mesilla, many of the people that had moved to the new town of Ascension will be part of the Ascension Revolt of 1892. So here you have an issue where, because of all those problems that I already mentioned, there was an election, again, it involves again, a political election in the town. Rafael Ancheta, he was a politician with a bad reputation in Ascension. he was said to have taken part on those faulty surveys that were used sometimes by politicians in the area just to get more taxes and money out of the people. And when he won the elections of 1892, he was confronted by people of Ascension who claimed that he had committed fraud. Again, you have a conflict that ended up in open revolt. Rafael Anchieta was lynched. He was tortured and lynched by people in Ascension. Around 130 men took up arms in open revolt against regional governments. And when federal forces arrived to the town, we again see this dynamic of going back and forth in the border. When federal forces arrive to the town, those who have not been captured yet will flee again to Mesilla, and they will use all their family connections to claim U.S. citizenship. They will claim U.S. citizenship, they will use all those connections to try to avoid the extradition processes that the Mexican government imposed on those who were captured on American soil. And you have cases, for example, in the family signs, where people was actually able to avoid the Mexican authorities because of all the connections and money that they have generated in that Mesilla Ascension circle. So just to summarize all that had been said here, I want to reiterate that the whole purpose of this study was to look into help people fare once they move out of New Mexico, something that still needs more scholarship to understand the different dynamics and the different ways that people in New Mexico thought of their national identity, and how they will use the border as some sort of refuge, as a place where they could exercise some authority while they were being pressed by both the American and the Mexican governments to comply to the notions that both nations had of nation-state projects. To talk a little bit about the work that I've done with archives, I want to thank Dennis Daly, who was my mentor during the internship. He helped me a lot in navigating the archives and locating potential sources of information for this project. I also want to thank Samuel Cisneros, who is one of my references and who was very helpful too in my visit to Albuquerque. I went to Albuquerque just looking for 3 documents that I had located on online guides, and he ended up showing me boxes and boxes of collections that had direct relation to the colonies in Mexico. Also, some of the archives that I went through, I want to recognize the work that the NMSU has done through the archives and special collections in recollecting some of these documents pertaining Mexican history, because as you can see, most of this information comes from the archives at Juarez, the archives at the Archdiocese of Durango, and there are resources that sometimes can be overlooked, because if you are doing research on New Mexico history, you might think that these archives don't pertain that much to this region, but they are really rich in providing sources of not just this particular topic, but other topics that involve the movement of people and the creation of these places that we know today. So there's my contact information. I just remembered now that I was talking about Ascension. I also want to thank Humberto Gomez Fernandez. He's the official chronicler of the municipality of La Ascension down in Chihuahua. Dennis Daly and I went to Ascension trying to access local archives. There isn't a local archive, but we found this man, Humberto Gomez, who has a family collection that goes back to the time that people in Mesilla started to migrate to Chihuahua. And even if his family comes from southern Chihuahua, he has a really rich collection of documents in which you see the connections that families in the city are doing in this area of Mexico. He's a little bit wary about sharing a lot of the stuff that he has because of bad experiences with local authorities, but lately we have been able to work with him, so he starts to share some of that documentation, and I hope that in the future he will agree to digitalize and make all that collection, which provides valuable information in the early years of Mesilleros in Chihuahua, into an institutional archive. There's my contact information, and thank you very much for listening to the presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody. In my talk I called A Girl from Texas and Her Dog. And first I'll answer the question, well, who was Anita Lee Blair? Anita Lee Blair was born in 1916 in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and she died in 2011, 93, in El Paso. Now, Anita Lee Blair was the first woman to represent El Paso in the Texas State House of Representatives in 1952, but she was also the first blind woman to hold any legislative office in Texas. And she was at least the second blind woman to hold a legislative office in the United States. So Anita Lee Blair served one term in the state legislature from 1953 to 55. She was an advocate for people with disabilities. Now, her New Mexico connections in 1936 near Alamogordo on the Dark Highway. This is before they had safety glass, and she was in a car accident with her sister and a friend. The friend was driving. He was driving too fast and were blocked by lights of an incoming car, and it crashed into a parked truck that parked on the side of the road. So she suffered, of course, the most severe injuries, and the other passenger did. Now, she had lived in Alamogordo in the 20s because her mother had tuberculosis. So she was sometimes moving around, living with relatives. So she knew the Otero County Sheriff, who became J.P. Howard Beecham. And she, thanks to his quick thinking, he was able to get her to a hospital in El Paso because that hospital could treat her injuries. So she was able to adapt to a world that was not made for people who were blind. Now, she learned Braille and other skills at the El Paso Lighthouse for the Blind. And she made, dish towels, baskets, but she wanted more independence. She wanted to do more things. So after World War II, and even before World War II, there was a seeing eye dogs that came from Europe. And she felt a seeing eye dog would give her the independence. So she had been working for the national company from California, transcribing Braille. It was a way for her to earn a little more money than what she was doing to make dish towels and baskets. So from a gift from meat, he owned a meat plant in El Paso, J.G. Payton, she got a German shepherd named Fawn, named after his color. And she went to Moortown, New Jersey for Seeing Eye Incorporated, which is still in business and is a famous praise school and one of the first. And she came back to El Paso in 1940 where she was the first person in El Paso to have a seeing eye dog. She, I think at the time, there were just 15 people in Texas who graduated from the school who had a seeing eye dog. Now, her and Fawn got attention in El Paso and were asked to talk to schools and different groups. So she talked about her time with Fawn and how Fawn helped her. But she also talked about accident prevention as well. But her presence also, in a way, contributed to her becoming an early disability rights advocate. She, because of an incident involving when her sister called a restaurant asking if they would allow her and her dog to come in, the restaurant first apparently told her okay, but when they came in, they were denied entry. Because of this, the city and the county decided to pass a law that required people to allow seeing eye dogs in public places. Also, she, at that time in the 30s, there was not a lot of employment opportunities for the blind. There was a lineup for the blind, a lot of it like what she was doing, making more vocational type stuff. But she fought for more employment opportunities. A few times she went to the courthouse 2 times to attempt to try to have ownership or contract the cigar or the soft drink operator. She had a vision that she wanted to have a program to train blind people. She went to the state school in Austin where they trained blind people to work at these stands. So she became an advocate for that, at the same time fighting her own battle. But she graduated, she went to UTEP, with at that time a college of the Texas College of the Mines and Metallurgy, with Fawn. And she graduated in 1944 and later earned her master's. She had worked with the USO. She sang and lectures in Army hospitals. She was a hostess for the different women organizations. But she had planned to become a teacher in a regular school, but she had decided that she wanted to become a lecturer. So she, after graduation, she went to Chicago, and she ended up from 1945 to 1950. She traveled all around the United States, speaking to factories, school, different organizations, the National Safety Conference on safety prevention. With Fawn, she had no secretary. She was her own secretary, her own manager. So she, 2 national events made her be known nationally. One was when, in 1946, she led a group of survivors when there was a fire in Chicago at the La Salle Hotel. One of the worst fires in Chicago. And it was down 11th fire escape, which you will see in the clip of a little movie that I have. But she, later on, the firemen commented she had a calming effect on the other passengers. Fawn later got an award from a local Animal Cruelty Society. So she, another event was in 1950 when she went to Washington, D.C. and was denied entry because of her dog. She refused to give up, and they let her in. She was also the only woman to serve on President Harry Truman's Safety Advisory Commission. Now, She did serve one term in the state legislature. She was defeated for re-election in '54. Two of the main reasons was because she supported a payoff, an investigation that was approved by the state house, her and another state representative from El Paso. It was an investigation of payoffs, and supposedly there was some kind of gambling setup going on in El Paso among public officials. The officials were exonerated. And many in El Paso, many of the media, was not happy because they felt it was bad publicity. And she, however, refused to back down and felt there was more to the investigation there needed to be a new investigation of the investigation. But the El Paso newspapers, an editor of an El Paso newspaper criticized her. She was censured by the El Paso mayor. And another issue that led to her defeat was, this was during the 50s, anti-communist. And in Texas, in the Texas House, the governor, Alan Servers, who she spoke out against, decided to wanted to approve some anti-communist legislation. She supported several, but opposed some, including one to make librarians identify books that were written by communists, another one to set up a UN, sort of a state committee in a house, sort of like the Congress Committee on Un-American Affairs. She also opposed any proposal of Senator Joseph McCarthy coming to speak to this Texas State House of Representatives. And her opponent says she she brought bad publicity, negative, black-eyed El Paso. So she was defeated. She tried running back several times, but well into her 80s, she made her last run for El Paso County judge when she was 83, and still spoke at went to the talk radio, government meetings, and still remained a controversial, polarizing figure. But I started researching her probably when I was in middle school, and I went to almost all the archival I could find in El Paso, and I even got to have an oral history, which I recorded and made sure it was donated, a copy to the El Paso County Historical Society before her death. Then when I was getting my minor in museum studies, I got to intern at UTEP Library, the Special Collections, and got to do a finding aid for her papers. As well, when I was at the Historical Society, I also processed other archive that came up. Most recently, I'm working with the El Paso County Historical Landmark Committee. We're working to make a historical landmark that we're going to be outside Austin High School, where she graduated in 1933. Definitely her story needs to be told. Everything about her, the controversial side of her, everything in history. So, let me go to the next slide here. See if I can figure this one out here. Okay. Sure, it should play on its own. So this is from one of her films she made. Color films in 1945. She would take along to the different schools, she would talk, and then she would play this video. This is a short clip.
She carefully guided me down the fire escape with hundreds of people in front and behind us. Because she took good care of me and did not jump around on the fire escape when she might have been frightened and caused a great deal of confusion, Fawn has been given several awards. Had this been a different seeing eye dog in the same situation, that dog would have done exactly as Fawn did. Every day, all of these dogs faithfully take care of the blind person they guide. Fawn has guided me through a happy life so that I can live without fear of being hurt when I try to go from one place to another. Surely, if dogs can be trained to only cross streets at street corners all the time, then people can remember to go to a corner to cross the street. Use your eyes, use your ears, and then use your feet. Always be careful and walk in safety.
So yes, it was hard to hear, but they were digitized. I got them digitized from the reels, and she actually had them done for free because the guy who did them was impressed by Fawn, the seeing eye dog. So I hope I was able to, from the time I was allotted, was able to tell you some things about Anita Blair, and thank you.
First of all, thank y'all. Thank everybody for inviting me to come here today. It was kind of a special event. I got a little notice from Woody there back there, and he mentioned this particular event. He says, Mike, maybe you ought to come and talk to a group of folks about where you're going and about the history of Black El Paso, especially Black businesses. And I thought that was kind of an interesting one. And so I said, yeah, okay, I'll do it. And then I sent in a request to come and speak to y'all, and I really appreciate it because we are at a apex where we're going. About 2 years ago, in fact, you heard a few minutes ago in that introduction about a lady called Miss Estine. Miss Estine Davis is no larger than 5 feet 2 1/2, weighed about 99 pounds. Okay, and she was cutting hair, or had been cutting hair in El Paso for over 70 years. She first started cutting hair at Logan Heights, then she went and bought a barbershop from her godfather, and she's been in that same place, 106 North Piedras, for over 70 years. Now, what she has done more than just cut hair is that she's also, not only is she an entrepreneur, she had her own modeling troupe, she's been a community activist. She built floats for the Sun Carnival Parade in the back of her barbershop. And then as one person told me a few days ago when I told them that if you don't help them get those barber chairs converted over and fixed, he says, please don't. And I told him I'm going to bring my mom. And she's 91 years old. And he says, sir, don't do that. She's an icon. I don't think I can handle her. Now, what y'all don't know is what she would have said, because she's pretty sharp. So even at this point, the day that she retired, we had to force her to retire. So in September 2022, we finally forced her to close the barbershop and said, that's it. That closing of the barbershop meant it is the last Black-owned business in Eastside Central El Paso. Since 1890, it closed its door. There were no other Black-owned businesses from there. The history of Black businesses and its contribution to the El Paso community, to the growth of El Paso, is significant. I'm going to read something to you, but a little bit later on, but it is so important that you understand that, because when I read it to you, you'll see what I'm talking about. We talk, and you've heard about the Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. El Paso had its own Black Wall Street. We had our own Black Wall Street. A lot of people didn't know that, but you're going to hear a little bit about it in a little bit. Now, what caused me to go back and visit this was because of my mom's retirement. The El Paso Museum of History was working on a special project. They wanted to honor the contributions of all Black El Pasoans. And they came to the barbershop. After that session, we walked out and they said, we would like to hold an exhibit, execute an exhibit at the El Paso Museum of History. So Ms. Erica Marine, Ms. Nora, both of them, both curator and deputy curator at the El Paso Museum of History, we met that following Monday, and 4 months later, the exhibit was activated, was initiated, and that exhibit was called Still We Rise. That exhibit lasted not 12 months, but 16 months, and it identified every facet of Black history. It started in 1880, well, a little bit before that, actually, with the Buffalo Soldiers coming through there and being stationed there at Fort Bliss, right across from Juarez in certain barracks, to today. And what occurred from that was actually an initiative to do something more than just understand, discover and understand our history, but from that theme, and I'll explain it to you, we went further. Still means we're going to recognize the history of the past and make sure that everybody introduced to what that history is. We rise means we're going to take that history and all of the efforts and those contributions from those who were part of that history, to include Ms. Esteen, and we're going to share that not only with today, but we're going to build a community, rebuild that district so that it becomes a more economic, profitable, growing area for El Paso. How do we do that? And that's something we're going to talk about. But let me just go back and talk a little bit more about the history of El Paso. And especially, you probably hear my voice raise up a little bit when I start talking about US 10. Interstate 10 is not one of my favorite places, favorite initiatives that occurred, but you probably could tell from that. As I mentioned to you, El Paso had its own Black Wall Street. When US 10 was introduced into El Paso in 1950 through the 60s, what it did, it displaced Black families. Those families lived in what we call East Side, now it's East Side Central El Paso. But where did that growth come from? After the Civil War, there were freedom colonies. Black Americans moved, went through. In fact, a good example of that is in Davila, Texas. On my mother's side of the family, there's a freedom colony. The freedom colony consists of 4 anchors: a church, a general store, a cemetery, and a school. Now, that school is normally called Rosenwald schools. There are 2, 3, 4 type schools where Black children went to school from grade school all the way through high school. Black Americans traveled through El Paso, and many of them were heading west, Arizona, of course, and California. Many settled in El Paso. And when they did, because of Jim Crow and other statutes that prevented Black Americans from participating in the normal services and opportunities, they decided they were going to create their own community. So they grouped together. If you've ever been in El Paso, Texas, downtown, part of downtown used to be, a lot of Black businesses were there. Many of them were hotels, restaurants. We had a few, trying to think some of the names that they call them, clubs, okay, that they would attend. And I'll talk about another club that you would like, probably listen to, you probably remember the individuals who participated in it. But that business, those businesses were downtown, they were located downtown, and as they continue to grow, and as they continue to work, many people who decided to work for the railroad, as part of Pullman Porters, they decided to stay there. Mr. Grant Berry, for example, was one of those. Or if you look at the Buffalo Soldiers, Mr. Hill, Pat Hill, Jethro Hill's father, grandfather, was a Buffalo soldier. He was stationed there. Or my family left Davila and went west to work as part of the Conservation Corps in 1940s. They helped build Biggs Air Force Base at Scaredy Park. So there's a whole group that migrated through to El Paso, and then they became part of that community. They lived in what was called, moved to Second Ward. They continued to work, grow, and as businesses began to grow more and more and provide more opportunities, then there was a migration from Second Ward across Pastiano to Alameda Piedras, and then further on. But it stopped. It stopped at a street called Montana and 5 Points. There were no more blacks that went further than that. But during the peak of all that time, between the 20s and the 60s, there were over 65 to 75 black businesses in that area. They had pharmacies, there were doctors, there were lawyers, they had, as I mentioned, restaurants, and etc. For one particular restaurant, and I'm sure some people might have heard of this term, the Chitlin Circuit. How many people have heard about the Chitlin Circuit? How many people have heard about Ike and Tina Turner, Joe Tex, James Brown, Jackie Wilson? Guess where they played? A Chitlin Circuit called Club Society on Alameda Street. My aunt was one of the managers at that club. And I used to sneak around there from my mom's barber shop, where I shouldn't have been, at the age of 5, just to see Ike and Tina Turner. She was my first love. Okay? I can tell you that truthfully, she was my first love. I thought she was the most beautiful lady I could ever see. Until my aunt kicked me out and told me to go back to my mom. And she will tell. There was over 60 black businesses in that area. But the introduction of Interstate 10 completely destroyed that community. What used to be Manzana and Madera was no longer that. It's now called Gateway East and Gateway West. And the families that lived there, many of them tended to churches like Second Baptist, which was formed in 1880s, or Shiloh Baptist Church in 1921, Visitors Chapel, AME, 1883. These were old standing churches where black El Pasans came and attended. Those members of that congregation ended up leaving. They were moved, eminent domain, were forced to move and leave that area. And where did they go? To places now they call Hacienda Heights or Northeast El Paso. If you talk to some folks, they would have thought Hacienda Heights was the black community of El Paso. It was not. It is not. It was not the original. So what happened then was pretty much the destruction and movement of the black community at that time, culture, and its history. Sadly enough, it's 2024, and Interstate 10 is resurfaced. And they're getting ready to do something again that may end up destroying not only the black community and its culture, when I said just a few minutes ago, its history. Because how will we identify those black institutions and organizations that are still there right now if eminent domain removes those institutions like Visitors Chapel, Mount Zion, Phillips AME, or one facility called the McCall Center, founded by Mrs. Leona Washington, my godmother, co-founded by that little lady I told you about weighing 92 or 99 to 92 pounds, Miss S.D. That could all be gone in a matter of a few years. Our challenge is to help keep that history. And so part of what we say Still We Rise means that we're going to try to do things more than just fight that type of battle. We're going to try to establish an archives that allows us to capture that history, one. Two, if we can introduce some type of new technology, not some type of new technology into the community that will allow that community to grow economically, there may be a better chance for us to be able to save that organization, that community. It's very important. And I'm not talking a community of just blacks, I'm talking about a community, a diverse community of Hispanics, whites, and blacks in that area. But it's a low-cost community. Transportation, highways, department, those type of initiatives have reaped harm throughout the United States going into low-income communities and displaced families. But the challenge is for us is to find a way to continue to grow that community. And there is a current plan called the Alameda Corridor Plan, which we hope to coincide with that action, will allow us to be able to change that community from where it is to what it is in the past to a community that is just growing, let's say, like we always say, out of its pants. Think about the introduction of Texas Tech Medical School in this university and what happened. When they brought that Texas Tech into the Alameda corridor, Piedras corridor, it grew that community, had tremendous impact on the economy. So we're trying to do something further than that. Better than that. I could talk about all of the different businesses that lived in that community from 1890. Some of those businesses, how many people are familiar with the Green Book? How many people saw the movie Green Book? Well, actually, several of those businesses I mentioned downtown El Paso are in the Green Book. You can find those. You can go to El Paso Museum of History and you'll see it in its archive, to include the University of Texas at El Paso. I could talk even more about all the different businesses, but it's just, I think the bigger challenge today now is how do we continue to hold on to what was the past, the history, but use that to help grow not only the community, but the people that live in the community and show young kids that there's a pathway forward by understanding that history, understanding technology, and then see what we can do to keep them home. Because one of the challenges that I found that when I went back to my church, the Shiloh Baptist Church, one of the head of the diocese said, my child got a bachelor's degree at University of Texas at El Paso, but she's leaving to go get a job. So what do? We have to find a way to keep them home. And we're bringing that type of technology into that community. You'll hear more about it pretty soon as we get involved in this. Probably could talk more about history in the different places, and I know y'all probably would have said that, but heck, if the two gentlemen before did a great job on that, what I wanted to actually do was raise an issue about how do we keep history, because history drives our train. It drove mine. It drove my curiosity. When I was, after that Still We Rise exhibit that we had, I went back to start doing a whole lot of legwork. The Museum of History and University of Texas at El Paso just has a truckload, more than a truckload, of archives in the history of El Paso and Black El Pasos. We are going to cultivate that and keep that. Okay? Thank you.
Good chunk of time to ask questions. Does anyone have a question to start us off with this afternoon? Yeah.
Question, why were the folks from Mesilla and Wyatt, why were they so, what was so attractive about Ascension?
So you ask about what was attractive in any particular sense, or just in?
Well, why Ascension? I mean, they could have picked any place there. I mean, why Ascension?
Well, something interesting when you look at that area, which is like northern Chihuahua, close to the border with Sonora, is that the towns of Guadalupe, San Ignacio, then you have today Ciudad Juarez. Those towns already took like the best land that was in the area. So instead of just incorporating into those places, it seems like the people from Mesilla saw a benefit in creating a new town in an area where they will have like exclusive rights to water sources around the zone. And you still have other smaller communities around that could help in the defense against Indian raids, which is like Janos, and even later communities like the Mormons. The Colonia Diaz, one of the first Mormon communities in Chihuahua, will establish just like, today it will be like an hour drive from Ascension.
They created Ascension?
Yeah,
Oh, I see.
yeah, they built the town from scratch.
Good question?
I just have a comment. I recently moved back home to the Southwest, but I watched the exhibit kind of online through social media, and it was brilliant. And to hear that it was the first time that anything like that was done, like, makes me so emotional. It really was a beautiful exhibit, and it's an honor to have you speak.
Thank you, thank you. The brainchild of the two ladies and their staff. Let's give credit to El Paso Museum of History.
It was a beautiful exhibit.
But now they've actually made the decision to establish a section of the El Paso Museum of History to Black history of El Paso, which has really been great. That decision was made last December, and between that and the McCall Center, which recognizes the individual accomplishments of Black El Pasoans, and then the business, we're going to establish this trio of historical goodness, data that people can capture. In fact, we are now going into the final stages of preparing the Black El Paso History Walking Tour brochure. And we've identified over 45 different places and exhibits that people can come in and attend. The brochures will be there not only at the museums, all three sites I just mentioned, but also at the Civic Center and et cetera. So that just one of the spin-offs of that exhibit. But then we even had some additional spin-offs, like we had the financial planning, we had medical discussions and et cetera during that summer. So we just continued on with that path and see what we can do to improve.
And I guess, have a second comment or question. Was that the same time, so on the other side of the freeway, would that be considered Segundo Barrio, and the Hispanic neighborhood had to deal with some saying, and could you speak maybe on that, if that is?
Yes, and Wood, you could help me on that as well if I missed something. Yes, it's on both sides, east and west Manzana, and then west side would be what used to, and my mom still lives there, called Medetta. So when you go across Copia, then there's the cemetery, Concordia Cemetery, and then there's Medetta. It's been recreated again, but that is now gone on the other side of Copia. There's the Missouri, what used to be called the Missouri Recreation Center, where that's the only place where Black children could go swim. I know, that's where I learned to swim. And now that's being threatened. It's called the Leona Washington Recreation Center, but if the broadening of the interstate happens, then that could be gone. Okay, along with the park associated with that and the churches and the McCall Center that we're talking about. And that impacts not only, we're talking a diverse community. Lincoln Park was a huge effort. It used to be a very diverse, but not mostly, I would say about 50% Black and white, Hispanic. And I went to school there. There's potential that can be disturbed, okay? So this is a big battle that we're looking to get engaged in. How do we work this? We don't know. But the one thing we need to be able to do is sit at the table and discuss alternatives. And that's what history allows you to do. Because we didn't have that opportunity in 1950, 1960 to sit at that table. Now we do.
Part of your question about the South El Paso is Sunset Heights, the rich part was on one side, and then the lower class on the other side.
Yes.
And I-10 split that. Okay. Now,
Yes.
with the widening of I-10, downtown is all banks, large mega businesses, but now they want to tear down the historic part because it's the path of least resistance. So, yeah, that's still happening.
It's good.
Are they going to reroute the train tracks?
They rerouted some of them for the Loop 375 expansion, but they are looking at moving some if they do the expansion.
So they can. So they have a waste of money.
Yeah, they're going to need some of that space.
The questions?
I have a question. What got you into Anita?
Okay, well, that was well, that was actually, I'm not really sure how. It's a difficult question. I know when I was younger, I got interested in history, and I guess it was through accident that I read something about her, and I, of course, researched her on the internet, and at that time she did have a reputation. I did reading something about this woman being serving in the 1950s, blind legislator, and I became interested in finding out more about it.
Thank you.
Joel, you had mentioned doing research in Asunción this past summer, and I was wondering if you came across people who have historical memory of this migration in Chihuahua, their connections with Mesilla, or vice versa, people who lived in Mesilla and had some family memories or other recollections of having moved to Asunción.
One of my first impressions was that both towns are like the complete opposite when it comes to historical memory. Because when you walk through Mesilla, you even see like all these memorials, right? It's full of historical markets. You go to the plaza and you see both the Mexican and the American flag with the year, 54, the year of the Gadsden Purchase. That's not the case in Asunción. There's a couple of visual clues around the town. Yes, there's a little marker that talks about the year in which the families came from Mesilla, but people in the town don't really seem to have like that connection with that part of their history. And I think that's why it is interesting to look at the dynamics that took place once people settled in those towns, because something that is actually very remembered in Asunción is the Mexican Revolution of 1910, especially because Asunción is the town where Pancho Villa raised his personal guard, Los Dorados de Villa. So now most of the historical memory or historical identity of the town revolves around that particular event.
When doing your research on all the businesses and everything, did you come across any, stuff that you were interested to find out? Like, oh, I didn't even know that was something here in El Paso.
That's a good question, because you're absolutely right, I did. I grew up, I shined shoes at my mom's barbershop, so I knew all of the different places on the Alameda Pitch. But I didn't know half of the businesses that were downtown until, we sit down with the Museum of History and the University of Texas El Paso in their archives and found out some of these hotels like Gym Hotels, the Savoy Hotel. Where did this come from? Okay, I didn't. So I went, found it. I'll tell you how challenging it was. My mom graduated from Douglas High School, which was an all-black high school, grade school and high school. I didn't know that there was the original Douglas High School downtown. And so I decided, okay, now where the heck is that? Because everybody's talking about it, but I ain't seen it. I went by there, drove by it. Then I stopped, got out the car, started taking pictures. So then I started sending notes to everybody else saying, hey, you know, did you go to this? Did you go see this? Did you know that that's there? No, I didn't know. I said, well, man, okay. So every time, you know, when you see something like that, then you say, okay, now let me share it. When you share it, then everybody else says, okay, now let's go ask some more questions. Yes, I did. I did a lot of legwork after that. And it's on my iPad, and I have pictures everywhere, you know, where I went back and checked to see what was going on. And I actually went to Second Ward, which I wasn't very far from it because we lived there. We lived in the TASE projects, where it was integrated, the integrated TASE projects. First ones, correct me if I'm wrong on that. But we lived there. My mom moved from Potsdam over to TASE, and I thought it was a big deal. Okay. Had fun living there, and then my mom said, it's time, I'm moving. So she did like everybody else. Her business grew. She generated enough money to move. She built her own house. She moved over there. She's still there now. Okay. And so that's the way, you know, businesses have a strong impact on the economy, on the lives of people. They will allow them to give them opportunities to do something more.
Yeah.
And that's beautiful.
Can I add something to Joseph's? Anita Blair's education was financed by Helen Keller. It was really neat. And I want to give kudos to Joseph because he saved her typewriter and all her belongings after she passed away. And those things are really neat historical items. So thank you, Joseph.
I'd be interested in asking each of you, I'm an archivist and I work with folks like yourself every day, and it's exciting for me to see the work that you're doing, to know how you each go to archives or historical sites and places and pull meaning and information out of those, and are so excited about the projects you're working on. How do you, when you're talking to, say, an average person or maybe a family friend, explain to them what it is that you're actually working on and what makes you excited about historical work and doing this kind of research? How do you impart that to others?
When I talk about that with my mom, she's just like, well, that's cool, and the conversation goes anywhere else, right? I do find it to be like really rewarding, especially in my own experience now that I'm going to these towns, and usually you take to granted go to an institution that has a mindset that this is information that we want people to have access to, but then you go out in the field and sometimes the dynamics are completely different. Sometimes there are personal belongings and people will have doubts about sharing too little or sharing too much. But yeah, when approaching to people who do not have a strong interest in the field of history, I guess I just go back to some of the concepts that we already heard, that historical memory plays a huge role in identity and the dynamics that take place within a certain community. So I just try to do a lot of emphasis on that aspect.
Well, you know, it is a hard question because there are people who are interested, and there are people, like you were saying, say, oh, that's good, and they don't really seem to care after that. But there are people who they don't like, and not that they're not interested in history. It's like my mom, they didn't have the best history teachers. So you sort of have to be patient with them. And a lot of time people, they don't know about that information. And a lot of time they know more than you think they know through personal memory. And you're telling them this, sometimes suddenly they say, oh, I remember that. Even people who you talked to before who you don't think, and I've been to that time when they heard me talk and suddenly says, they said, oh, I know her. And I said, well, you didn't tell me that before. So I guess it depends on the people, but you have to just keep on telling anybody who will listen and on whatever mediums you can do. And it's important to preserve the history, but also get people to come and use those archives, because then the archives will be there for a long time and nobody will know that they're there. So a lot of you really have to have this awareness that yes, there are archives there, and you don't use the microphone.
For me, it happened over my 28 years in the military. Because everywhere you would go, someone would say, I would tell them, I'm from El Paso, Texas. And they said, I didn't know there were any blacks in El Paso. And I said, come on, guys. Yes, there are black Americans in El Paso. And they said, where? Where are they? Et cetera. And I said, oh, good Lord. So finally, this was given to me, this opportunity was given to me. And now I said, okay, let's take this on and see what we can do to change the scope of what people think about El Paso and the Southwest. Because there's a deep history here in the Southwest. So we need to capture that and then relay that to folks so they can understand it.
Last question?
So I was born and raised in Northeast El Paso, so I was kind of wondering if you've done any research in that area of the city.
Not yet, because to me, Northeast El Paso is new. No pun intended. Having been born in 1953, et cetera, et cetera. When Interstate 10 came in and it split that community, as mentioned, folks went to Northeast or they went to Hacienda Heights. My cousins lived in Northeast. Why? Because it was close to the military base. Okay? And so, but I have not studied it. I haven't looked at that yet. Didn't look at what is Dyer Street? Dyer? Oh my gosh. I haven't looked at that. I'm too busy trying to find out everything I can find out about East Side and Central.